Well, hello once again, everyone. Welcome to After Further Review with Mark Ferrer and John Pelkey. Producer Jeff Taylor with us as always. Certainly hope you're having a good week or 5 days, I guess, since we last dropped in on you on Monday, depending on when you listened. Well, it's a good thing we're doing a deep dive today, Mark, because really nothing in sports happened this week.
No, we've had actually some listeners chime in to say maybe you
Answer this crap.
Maybe you'll put off Deep Dive 7 and just, talk about sports because there's actual sports, actual things going on, which are highly noteworthy.
Yep, I guess so, but it doesn't matter because we're going to go look back 50 years at an oft-forgotten game because what the hell, Mark and I have nothing to do but research papers.
Yes.
Which is really what this has turned into. And very quickly, though, before we jump into this, we're going to try to, I'm going to try to make this a little more succinct than our deep dives have become. Economy of words. College football. I mean, that is obviously the huge story. I mean, playoffs and stuff going on. But the fact that the Pac-12 and the Big Ten have both said they're not going to play. I just want to ask you, Mark, what's your level of confidence with the SEC, ACC, and Big 12 at this point?
Well, I will tell you this, John, that my level of confidence is relatively high because I think they're going to be it. First of all, let's start with this. Let's face it, college football has become a regional sport. For the most part, outside of the South, people don't care as much. A little bit in the Midwest here and there, but people in the Northeast
Big Ten
don't
country
care.
Still pretty big. Ten country still pretty big deal.
In the Midwest to some degree, yes, I agree with that. But
it's not on the coasts, you elite, you coastal elite.
Well, the two coasts, which is everything west of the Mississippi, and yes, the South, including Texas. That's why the Big 12 is interesting, but it's very regional. The best teams now that Ohio State has opted out because that's the only team outside of the South, John, that is competitive nationally. That's the only team.
Well, I mean,
so it's a regional sport, and
Wisconsin's a good football team. Minnesota had a good year, but to your point, the only team outside of the South that's going to contend for a national championship, to your point, is Ohio State.
So
apologies to Penn State fans listening, Lenny. Sorry.
So now they're out, and it's essentially a regional sport. And I think in this region, we've seen this. Regardless of how you come down on the political side of things, the South has tried its best to live with this, if you will, to live with the virus, for better or for worse. That's a whole series of shows.
Yeah. But
with that spirit in mind, they're going to see if they can make football work. And I think there'll be a little bit of a template there for the NFL also. So I'm frankly hoping that they can, because I think that the more we can learn to live with it safely, responsibly, obviously with those caveats, is the better we are. I think if anyone's rooting for, college football to implode or things to just keep going to hell just because it's, for some political reason.
Yeah,
I don't know. I think there might be something going on in the fall politically, but I think we need to just step past that and just root for it. Root for us figuring this damn thing out. Because, John, the reality of us truly never working our chosen field again is becoming starker and starker.
It's not a joke. It literally is a self-fulfilling prophecy at this point. I don't think there's any doubt about it. Yes.
There's no doubt about it. Anyway, so I'm rooting for it, and I'm relatively optimistic. I'm in the 80s, I think. Low 80s, but 80s. How about you?
I really think they're going to start a season. Now, whether they're able to finish the season, there were a lot of things going on there. I also thought, and before we jump in, and we're going to jump in really, really quickly, though I will point out our buddy David Lowe's comment about he's so happy about the Big Ten, and he's a Northwestern grad, but happy about the Big Ten canceling football because of how angry the Ohio State fans are. And I agree with that. So as long if they're unhappy, I'm happy. That's all I'm going to say. But the other thing is baseball talking about bubbling for the playoffs was the other story that I thought. I think that may be a smart move for them, given the possibility of a spike again in the fall and the fact that the couple of breakouts that we have seen, we've talked about this, are generally due to guys not using good common sense, and some guys, Clevenger, still not doing it from time to time. But they've done a nice job mitigating. But I do like the idea where they're talking about perhaps doing that for the playoffs, because I think that gives them a really, really solid chance of getting through a World Series, even if there is a spike.
We talked about it in the last episode, how successful the NBA and the NHL are. What is it? Jeff and John, you guys might know this, but I read something that there's 7,000 tests that have happened in the NHL thus far.
I think it was 7,700.
0 positives.
Yep.
And when's the last positive for the NBA? Maybe 3-4 weeks ago?
Yeah, I mean, it's been a while.
The bubble clearly works.
Now the NBA is opening the bubble a little over there at Disney. So that's something to keep an eye on, because they're going to start letting family members and stuff come in. And again, you start adding people, there's always going to be trouble. But I think they've done an excellent job. I agree with you. And I love. Are they
going to let local PA announcers come in as well?
No. In fact, I called the office over at the ESPN Wide World of Sports, and they must have caller ID, because if they don't, this is probably frowned upon. Literally picked up the phone. I don't know who it was. Just said, "Go to hell." And then hung up, and I'm like, all right, yeah, probably should go to hell.
Lake of Fire.
Clearly, they knew it was us. I'm not a Yankee fan. It won't be straight to the Lake of Fire. They'll actually have to explain to me why I'm burning in hell.
At least you'll have a transition.
Yeah,
Yankee fans don't.
I think it's all you can ask for.
We know this.
It's all you can ask for. All right, so you ready to do this thing?
I am. I can't wait for this. I love this topic, John, because it's underreported. We've been talking about it for a while now. Not a lot of people talk about Super Bowl IV.
Right. And because it's not really a great football game when it comes down to it, though I did watch the broadcast of the entire game, and there is no network broadcast of the game. There's a restoration of the game largely in black and white, with also some NFL film stuff thrown in there that some guy took just went after, and it's taken from a kinescope of the broadcast in Canada. That's where it comes from. So it's the CBS team, and we'll talk about those guys in a minute. But there is no video. There's no full game video of the game, because recording on tape was expensive. So basically what they would do was they'd record it, and then they'd pull off highlight stuff, and then they just erase the tape. Inconceivable today that could happen.
It is. I also think that they just weren't that into it, and they probably were worried. If you think about it, John, in terms of corporate conglomerates that have, ruled the world, we can probably go back about 50 years when it all sort of coalesced, and part of it was around the NFL. They realized after this one, it's like, this is not going to work. We need to engage the crowd, the nation, with a story. So let's start with an America's team in the 70s. Let's start that next year. Yeah. Let's go back to the old NFL Colts that everyone loves. And from then on, it was pre-planned.
Well, television in the 60s really built the NFL. I mean, that is it became, prior to that, baseball is America's pastime, but really what brought football to the fore was it's a better television game. I think both of us agree that you see a lot more. You can go to a baseball game and watch a baseball game on television and get somewhat the same experience as to what you're seeing. A professional or college football game in a stadium is vastly different than what you see on television, and the television coverage, given the way the game is just much better. All right, so we'll debate that another time. We'll dive into sports broadcasting, but let's jump into the road to Super Bowl IV. Starting with Super Bowl III, Mark, as you know, in January of 1969, Super Bowl III, the upset of the century. The New York Jets upset the Baltimore Colts. There we see Joe Namath, 16-7. The Jets were 18-point underdogs in that game. And at that point, Mark, and you were 8 then, so you're starting to get aware of, but I'm only 4 years old. I don't remember any of this. But the 18-point underdog thing, from everything I've seen, seems like it's pretty conservative given what people thought was going to happen in this game.
Well, you have to remember that the NFL was a powerhouse.
Yeah.
They were the established league. The narrative was they had the better team. Look at the first 2 Super Bowls. Green Bay rolled over Kansas City and rolled over Oakland. And so now here we are. The Jets come in, who are a fancy, flashy team with some, and
they've been terribly inconsistent with Joe Namath. They have been a very inconsistent team.
Joe Namath, an inconsistent quarterback. Really, he's the most overrated Hall of Famer probably out there. You could make an argument. But the thing is that Baltimore, you forget how dominant they were. I think they lost one game that year. And in the championship game, they beat, this Cleveland Browns team was a perennial playoff team. And we'll get to that a little bit later, and then won the championship only 4 years prior. They shut them out like 34 to nothing.
I think, yeah. I believe 34 to nothing was the score of that game. Yeah, it was. Many people considered that Baltimore Colts team the best team in NFL history. And remember, that's coming after the Green Bay Packer run, where, so that's saying a lot. But it was a huge upset. It changed a few people's minds, but not the majority of people. The majority of people still thought there was a lot of talk, and I went back and read a bunch of stuff, a lot of talk, and even from Colts players saying we probably took them too lightly. I don't necessarily think that's correct. I think the Jets may very well have been a better coached team, if I may, at that point. I know that's no slight on Don Shula, who's one of the all-time greats, but I think they were better coached for the game, better prepared for the game. The Colts may very well have been over-rehearsed and underprepared.
Yes. And I think, to your point, and you may allude to this later, but they, one decade was playing another in terms of coaching style.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
And I mean, think about it in our country as well. Just everything was about the old and the new. And the fact that Namath did that and upset the apple cart so remarkably really set everyone on a path to saying that that's possible. But you're right, John. If it wasn't followed up like that, it would have been forgotten as a blip.
Yeah, absolutely.
As a fluke.
Yep, it really would have. All right, so let's jump back in our story now. Let's jump back and talk about the AFL a little bit. It had come into existence in 1960. It was the fourth direct competitor to the NFL. There had been other AFLs, Mark, American Football Leagues, in 26, 36, and 40. None of them had survived. The successful league prior to the AFL had been the All-American Football Conference, which existed from 1946 to 1949. I think, Mark, sometimes it's forgotten because it actually, 3 teams from that league ended up in the NFL, but the Cleveland Browns were champions every single year. So yes. I think a lot of people forget there was a whole league involved with getting Cleveland to the NFL, but they just dominated.
And then, underrated quarterback, Otto Graham, number 10. He's just that, or 60. I'm sorry.
He wore different numbers because they had those funky numbers early on, and then they started to try to change that and give uniform numbers for different positions. But yes, he's number 60.
and so, but I mean, you're right. What they did, what Cleveland was able to do back then, Otto Graham played in 10 consecutive championship games, half of those in the NFL.
Yeah, absolutely. A couple of interesting things about the American Football Conference there. The All-American Football Conference. Sleepy Jim Crowley was their commissioner. Oddly, jumping back to my 1941 talk, Elmer Layden was the NFL commissioner at that time. If you're watching on YouTube, that's Sleepy Jim up top left, and bottom right, that is Elmer Layden. They were both members of the famous Four Horsemen of Notre Dame. Now, I don't know if any thought was put into that, if maybe Layden and Crowley, let's just create that situation. Layden and Crowley hated each other, and Crowley had stolen Layden's wife. I don't know. We'll just make up some sort of story, and that he basically took on the commissionership of this league as a slap in the face to his old.
But again, the story ends in redemption, John, because they merge.
Yeah.
And maybe what? Because in the end, they realize that the memories they had sharing horses together on the gridiron.
Wow. This is gone. This thing has become oh my God. Now all of a sudden it's a Lord of the Rings story. He's laid with his horse. What? Jesus. God almighty. Say it isn't so. Oh,
yep. So it's a redemptive story. Yes, nonetheless.
They were able to merge a bit. As I mentioned, the 49ers and the Colts came over along with the Cleveland Browns. And it should be pointed out, in 1949, there was an exhibition game between the Philadelphia Eagles and the Cleveland Browns. Now, as we pointed out, the Cleveland Browns at that time were one of the best teams in well, they were the best team in the All-American Football Conference. The Eagles were also this Greasy Neal's Philadelphia Eagle team that was also very good in the NFL. And the Browns beat them 35-10. Now, it was an exhibition game, but it was pretty obvious at that point that these teams were on a par with one another. So Cleveland, 49ers, Colts, they move over to, they merge with the NFL for the 1950 season. And just to prove a point, the Browns decide, hey, look, we won all those AAFC championships. We don't care for the trophy. We don't care. It looks like Crowley's wife. I don't know. I'm not sure what it is. I have no idea. I'm going to stay with that story, the Crowley-Layden feud. The Browns go on to make it to the playoffs. They beat the New York Giants. They beat the Los Angeles Rams. And in their very first year in the NFL, they win the championship.
How about that?
It's pretty remarkable.
It's amazing.
Talk
it's
about a deep dive.
Story.
AAFC.
Paul Brown, AAFC. Great deep dive.
Yeah.
We're going further and further back. We're going to go very far back next week as well.
Right. Abner Doubleday, the early years. He was born in a
Marco Polo. Did he originate the underwater contest?
The Iron Age Lacrosse Championships. Yeah. Hey, these guys got a podcast.
Cain versus Abel.
Right. Cain, huge favorite in that. I was pulling for him.
Big time. At least 18.5 points.
All right, so we're going to jump ahead now to the American Football League, which again started in first season they play was 1960. Lamar Hunt was the man. That's him in the middle circle. If you're watching on the YouTube, was the man most responsible for that. Lamar Hunt had tried to purchase the Chicago Cardinals, which were the least successful team in the National Football League, as did Bud Adams. That's Bud on the left, who would be the Houston Oilers owner. They wanted to move them
forever.
to Dallas. Yes, they wanted to move them to Dallas. And of course, the NFL, first of all, George Preston Marshall, the vitriolically racist owner of the Washington Redskins, had a monopoly on the South. The Skins were, at that point, were the team that played furthest south in the National Football League. And he had a series of television networks. It was a little bit like the Yankees in that he had television networks all the way through the South into Texas. And the Redskins, the last team to integrate, by the way, were like the Southerners team. That was kind of the team that that represented the South. So he didn't want any competition, and he knew if you start getting other owners and moving teams to down south, that's going to affect him. So Hunt isn't allowed to do that. But Adams, they don't. They won't let in the old owners. They won't let in the old owners club. So Lamar Hunt gets the idea he's going to form his own league. The thing they had going for them, Mark, was you see Bud Adams and Lamar Hunt, both money. The other gentleman in the picture there was Baron Hilton from Hilton Hotels.
Yeah.
They had a lot of money. And that was important because most startup leagues don't have that kind of cash. Bud Adams, oil man.
Filthy rich.
Lamar Hunt, oil man.
Filthy rich. One of the Illuminati.
Yep, absolutely. Clearly.
You know what? Maybe that's the name. Maybe that's the subtitle of today's deep dive. Deep Dive 7, the road to Super Bowl 4, Lamar Hunt, Illuminati.
I like it. So by 1960, the AFL is set to go with their 8 teams. Should be pointed out that initially one of those teams was going to be in Minnesota. But the National Football League owners approached the ownership group for that Minnesota AFL franchise. So you get the sense that the NFL worried early on that they kind of realized, because they'd fought expansion, and probably had they expanded in the 10 years prior when they had opportunities, none of this would have happened. But they fought expansion. They offered a franchise in Minnesota to the National Football League, and the Vikings would come online in 1961, a year after the AFL. They are replaced by the Oakland Raiders. We're all better off because of that. because it created the best rivalry in the AFL and one of the flagship NFL teams for many of us who started watching the game in the early 70s.
Minnesota, by the way, would be a pretty interesting deep dive. Minneapolis, because in 61 they got the Twins as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So how about that? Getting a Major League Baseball and an NFL team in your city the same year.
And that 61 Minnesota Twins team was actually the Washington Senators, who were, first in love, first in peace, first in war, last in the American League was how they talked about the Senators. By the way, they would be replaced by another Senator team that would come online and play. So they never had a year where there was a disruption, and they were equally as bad as the original Senators.
And Calvin Griffiths, right, is his name?
Calvin Griffith.
Owner of the Senators, and then the Twins.
Yep. Absolutely. Very nice.
Virulent racist whose statue was taken down from the latest Twin Stadium.
Yep. Absolutely.
We should just point that out.
We should point that out. So your original 8 teams in the AFL, as I mentioned, were the New York Titans. They would become the Jets, Boston Patriots, Buffalo Bills, Houston Oilers, the Los Angeles Chargers, Denver Broncos, Oakland Raiders, and the Dallas Texans. Also should point out that in 1960, the NFL, on realizing that the Dallas market would now be taken over by the Texans, and that huge market could not be surrendered to the AFL all on its own.
Right.
They decided to make the world a dirty, dirty, ugly place, and they gave a franchise to the Dallas Cowboys.
So I think we have
and
the
Clint
Dallas
Murchison, who may very well have also been involved with Lamar Hunt's father in the Kennedy assassination. That's for another deep dive.
No, it really is. Dallas's connection to everything wrong with America is our next deep dive. I mean, that's I think most historians would agree with that premise. Wouldn't you, John?
Yeah, absolutely. We'll have Riley Claremont on, and we will debate who is more responsible for all the bad things that have ever happened, the Dallas Cowboys or England. Riley will argue for England. He believes the English are involved, and I believe it's either the Cowboys or the Yankees, one of those two things.
And those are all arguable points. So England did not contribute to, or they did contribute mightily to where we are right now.
Sure.
So that's good. So can we see that Texan? I want to see that Texan logo first, real quick. Well, if you don't mind, people are listening right now, going, "Why don't you just move on, Mark?"
Yeah.
Let's just move on.
All right, let's just move on. Another thing that we said they had deep pockets, the ownership. Another thing they really had going for them, Mark, is that they got a really good television contract early on with ABC, the American Broadcasting Company. And ABC, interestingly enough, Mark, was always the poor stepchild of all the networks. They had the least money.
Yes.
The thing about that is it made them the most flexible. In things that they did. They did innovative things. That's how Wide World of Sports came to be, and a lot of innovative things. Roone Arledge was certainly involved in many of those. But that ABC TV contract, Mark, gave the owners in the AFL almost exactly the same money that the NFL owners were getting from broadcast. So right away, this puts them on generally even footing as far as revenue goes.
See, think about that. That's just such classic American entrepreneurial, capitalistic kind of things, but it's very American. It's like we are languishing down here. So how can we actually use the fact that we don't have very many good shows and not great advertising revenue? How do we use that to our advantage? So, good for them.
It was one of the big reasons why. And that contract for the ABC TV was negotiated by a high-powered Manhattan lawyer by the name of Jay Michaels. Who the father of Mark, do we know?
I believe Al Michaels.
Al Michaels, absolutely correct. Al Michaels' dad helped negotiate the original ABC TV contract. The AFL would move to NBC.
So he came from big privilege, Al Michaels.
Oh, God, yeah. Explains so much.
Oh, it really does. Okay.
The first commissioner of the American Football League was, this is also very helpful. This is just background information on the AFL, was a guy by the name of Joe Foss. Joe Foss was a Medal of Honor winner, a World War II fighter pilot, and a hero. He was the governor of South Dakota at one point. He was president of the NRA in 1988. He was also a broadcaster. I mean, Joe Foss is one of these overachieving guys who's amazing. And he had a bit of a back. He played college football, did Joe Foss. But really what he was able to do for the AFL is no one could not take a call from Medal of Honor winner and World War II fighter pilot Joe Foss. And no one could close a door on him. So when they were discussing whether or not he wanted this job and what he thought he could bring to the table, he said, I can open every door in America. And he was really right. So they had a lot of things working for them.
They really did. And unfortunately, Joe Foss had ended tragically when Wayne LaPierre had him assassinated.
No, he was not killed by Wayne. He died of old age.
I thought that was how the transfer of power in the NRA happened. I guess I'm mistaken.
So that's what they had going for them. Also, should be said that they were remarkably stable early on. Most of the leagues, after their first year, the teams would fold and other teams would pop up. They only had one major move that first year, and that was that the Chargers, Barron Hilton's Chargers, went from LA to San Diego. That was really the only big change that they had. They did, however, have a couple of really they had a lot of really smart talent evaluators and also negotiators, because in their first year of existence, the AFL signed 75% of the NFL's first round draft choices.
Oh my gosh. That is truly rating
3 out of 4. Yeah. And they just basically threw money at people.
So the NFL did not know what hit them at this point.
Absolutely no idea. In fact, their biggest signing was Heisman Trophy winner out of LSU, the 59 Heisman Trophy winner, Billy Cannon. There's Billy. For those of you listening, again, I probably shouldn't say that. What he had already signed a contract with the Los Angeles Rams for $50,000. The Oilers and Bud Adams, with his deep pockets, offered Cannon $100,000. So Cannon, being Billy Cannon, and if you Google him, folks, he wasn't a terribly upstanding citizen for a lot, for many years, did time in prison for crimes not against humanity. I almost wanted to say that because it just would have been a funnier thing, but not. He didn't really. It's some financial.
That's where it was going. That's where the setup was bringing us. We all expected that.
Yes, exactly. Anyway, Cannon signed both contracts. The NFL sued the AFL, and the AFL won. And Billy Cannon went to the Houston Oilers. That was a big deal. But again,
a shot across the bow, if you will.
3/4 of their first round.
That is a remarkable statistic right there.
Yeah. Well, the NFL was just underpaying people.
Well, of course, but to be that brazen and that successfully brazen against this established behemoth, regardless of the problems that established behemoth were having, including underpaying their players, is still a remarkable achievement.
Yeah,
and
it really is.
It took guys with money, and it took a broadcasting network and some innovative, ballsy thinking, frankly.
Yeah, and also the NFL just kept thinking and I actually saw, I think, George Preston Marshall, again, vitriolic racist,
that guy,
saying that, we have the best players in the world. If we start expanding, it's just going to water down the product. And that's always been the argument. It wasn't a really good argument because there was a whole lot of talent that the NFL wouldn't even look at or had quoted as to how many of those players were allowed to be on their teams. I will allow everyone to guess what the common denominator of those players was: race. But anyway, I also mentioned the stability of the AFL. They had one other major move prior to 1966 when they expanded, and that was that the Dallas Texans left Dallas and left the state of Texas to the Cowboys, and moved to Kansas City to become the Kansas City Chiefs. Al Davis, who was working in Oakland, had started out with the Rams, with the Chargers, and then moved over to the Raiders.
The Raiders.
He took over as commissioner of the AFL on April 7th of 1966. At the same time, behind his back, without consulting him, after they made him commissioner, both Lamar Hunt and Tex Schramm of the Dallas Cowboys were negotiating a merger, because at this point, Mark, it all came down to money. And the NFL was bleeding money trying to keep up with the AFL. And a lot of the NFL's owners, who had been essentially, the NFL had been their their revenue source, but they'd been owners for so long, they couldn't keep up with the oil men and the hotel magnates.
They didn't have the pockets.
They didn't.
They were being outspent. Classic
They were.
story.
Anyway, Al Davis resigned, actually, as commissioner because of it, went back to the Raiders. Then the leagues made a decision that they would merge in 1970, but they'd start playing a championship game, the game now affectionately known as the Super Bowl. It was the AFL-NFL championship game after the 1966 season. So the first 4 Super Bowls, Green Bay, Kansas City, Green Bay, Oakland, Jets, Colts, and the one we're going to talk about in a bit, the Vikings and the Chiefs, were actually the AFL-NFL championship games.
Totally.
But there would be a merger in 1970 with Pittsburgh, Cleveland, and Baltimore moving over to the AFC. Follow the money in that as well. So this Super Bowl IV that we're going to talk about, which is important for a couple of different reasons, is also historic because it is the last AFL-NFL championship game. All right, so let's jump to the Vikings for a minute. As we mentioned, they started playing in 1961 after the NFL stole a franchise from the AFL. Their head coach was Norm Van Brocklin, the Dutchman. There he is. Mark, we were talking about it when we were putting this together. Norm Van Brocklin, not long retired as a player, was he?
He'd won the world championship for the Philadelphia Eagles in 1960. And in the 61 season for the expansion Minnesota Vikings, he was hired as head coach. I mean, how about that? He wins the equivalent of a Super Bowl, it's the NFL championship game. And then he becomes a head coach of a brand new franchise. Things were looking good for Van Brocklin in 61. But unfortunately, the story doesn't end there.
We'll revisit the Dutchman. By the way, last NFL championship that Philadelphia won, Norm Van Brocklin, last starting quarterback to win a championship until Nick Foles.
I know. How about that?
So that was, boy, talk about a team that couldn't live in the now. Oh, boy. All right. For his first 7 seasons in Minnesota, not surprisingly, as it is an expansion team, they go 32, 59, and 7, 8, 5, and 1 in 64. That's their only winning season. They had talent. There was talent on that football team. Mainly a quarterback by the name of Fran Tarkenton. Now, Fran Tarkenton was a preacher's kid from Georgia. Norm Van Brocklin was natural enemy of a preacher's kid from Georgia. He was a streetwise World War II veteran. There's a great quote, and I don't know if you got to this point in the 69 Viking documentary that I recommended, where Jim Marshall said he could string together expletives. And
I saw that.
Really funny. He goes, I thought it was really funny.
Jim Marshall thought it was hilarious.
Yeah, Jim Marshall didn't care. Tarkenton didn't.
Son of a preacher man did, though.
Yeah, he did. And also they clashed. Tarkenton clashed with coaches a little bit anyway because of his improvisational nature. And most coaches don't really go for that. Bud Grant didn't either. I mean, there were times when not necessarily that they clash, but he kept Tarkenton somewhat restrained and didn't like it when he wasn't restrained. Not unlike Staubach and Landry, frankly.
And think of this too, John. Norm Van Brocklin's a quarterback.
Yeah.
He just won a championship.
Right.
So he
could have suited up.
In his mind, not only can I suit up, but I'm at the top of the heap right now. What I say to you is truly much more credible than anything you, Fran Tarkenton, have to say to me.
Right. Well, Tarkenton wanted to be traded. He didn't care for what was going on, and he was in 1967 in the New York Giants. Oddly, Van Brocklin resigns after Tarkenton is traded. They traded Tarkenton for, I think, 4 draft picks, only one of which is important. They did get Ron Yeri, the great offensive lineman out of, I believe, USC, who went on to be a Hall of Famer and really anchored that offensive line for a team that would go to 4 Super Bowls. One of the all-time greats, Ron Yeri.
Yep. So there you go. How about that? They got Ron Yeri out of the deal.
And then they end up getting
Fran Tarkenton back. Yes, exactly.
So nicely, once again, the Ali Sherman New York Giants are not really a deep dive we ever need to do.
No, unless it's the early part of the decade when they went to 4 straight, championship games. I think lost them all.
But by that time, he'd outlasted his usewulness. Ali Sherman had.
Oh, by the late 60s, yes,
in any number of ways,
in way more ways than just professional.
Yes, exactly. Watch the America's Game on Super Bowl II. And you'll get some discussion of Ali Sherman, and does not paint him in a very particularly good light. But they bring in to coach the man that most of us remember as the Minnesota Viking head coach in their glory years, and that is Bud Grant. They bring Bud Grant in from Canada. He was from the upper Midwest. I think he was from, he might have been born in Minnesota, but Minnesota, Wisconsin, in that area. So local guy. More importantly, for the weather you're going to deal with, he had spent 10 seasons in Canada, and he'd won 4 Grey Cup championships in Canada.
I don't know if this is something you're going to say, John. We didn't discuss this particular point, but I really thought it was fascinating when they talked about the weather. And they talked about the fact Joe Cap is, because we're going to get to that. That's the quarterback that replaced Tarkinen. He's coming from Canada. Bud Grant won 4 Grey Cups in Canada. Well, they're used to the cold. And Bud Grant would say to his team, he said, no one ever gets used to it.
Right.
Make the decision that you're going to be cold. And he brought up an Eskimo team I think
about the Alaska pipeline.
Yes, that was
guys,
great.
Guys who were, when they were initially doing the pipeline, it was taking a long time because guys would work for a while and then they'd have to go and they'd have to drink coffee and they have to warm up because it's, 100 degrees below zero with wind blowing. And all of a sudden they started bringing in these Eskimos from that area.
Right.
And
native indigenous Alaskans.
Yeah, I'm not sure what the
Eskimos is. I'm sure.
It says that I'm sure I'm in trouble.
I'm sure it's looked down upon.
Thank God, not more people listen to this podcast because I would be cancel cultured the hell out of here. Dane Becker.
Oh my gosh,
my God, Dane Becker would be here so quickly.
2.
But that I found that interesting as well because that was the most interesting part of it to me because I had thought kind of maybe the same thing. It was like, well, they're in Canada. They were kind of used to it. And it was like, no. Everybody's dealing with it. It's too freaking cold for us to be outside, but we're here and we have a job to do.
Right.
So we can be out here not doing
it. Cold.
Yeah. We can be out here not doing our job or just doing it. Because it would suck to be that cold and then lose. So we might as well win.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, there was also a lot of talent on that Minnesota team at that point in time. Their defensive line is famous. 2 out of the 4 members are in the Hall of Fame. 3 should be. But the Purple People Eaters, the name of their defense, which, by the way, is a top 40 big hit by Sheb Woolley, who, when we talk sports movies, Mark, is in one of the greatest sports movies of all time. Plays a major role in Hoosiers.
Oh, really?
He's the high school administrator who hires Gene Hackman, who ends up, that's the great Sheb Woolley. So there you go.
Look at those cultural touch points. Well, I'll tell you, it was in line with the fearsome foursome for the Rams, with Deacon Jones and
who we'll see coming up soon.
Yep. And I mean, they like that. That's a fearsome foursome. That's a fun name. The Purple People Eaters.
They didn't care for it either.
They were not happy with that. But
they did not care for it.
Yeah. You're saying Carl Eller is the one that should be in the Hall of Fame, right?
No, Page and Eller are in the Hall of Fame.
No, Page and Marshall are.
Page and Marshall. Yes, Eller. My bad. Sorry. Stop that. Reverse it. You're right.
I'm sorry. I'm
looking down at my notes.
I'm not trying to call you out. I'm not trying to call you out in your deep dive.
It's perfectly fine. We're going to talk in a few minutes about how you think the Penguins are going to do on their run. But Alan Page, Carl Eller, Jim Marshall, and Gary Larson. And no offense to Gary Larson, who is a great player as well, but Page and Marshall are in the Hall of Fame. Eller should be in the Hall of Fame. And Jim Marshall, most famous for a play he made against your San Francisco 49ers on a fumble by my Super Bowl quarterback, Billy Kilmer, who was with the Niners at that point. The famous Jim Marshall's running the wrong way. Though Marshall does point out, and I don't know if you got to this point in it, but Marshall does point out that later he scores the safety because he goes the wrong way, but later he sacks the ball, which sacks. I guess it's Brody. No, who was it at that point in 19?
It must be Kilmer because he got the fumble.
He was the tailback. Kilmer was the tailback at that one. He was a tailback. He came back.
Probably Brody. Yeah, probably Brody.
Maybe Brody. And the Vikings picked it up and scored. So he traded 7 points for 2. Marshall.
Yeah, he's remembered for
Well, he did run the wrong way.
Yeah, he did.
Come on, he ran the wrong way.
Pretty vociferously too. He was into it.
Kezar Stadium. Did it look the same on both ends? Was that it? Was it hard to tell one end zone from the other? I was never there.
I was 10 years old, the one and only time I went, and it was for a championship game. And I don't have those kind of memories, John.
That defense also had Hall of Famer Paul Krause at safety. There's Krause, drafted by the Washington Redskins, but they were deep into that era where if you were good, you had to go. So that he ended up in Minnesota after that. So there are the Minnesota Vikings as laid out as we enter into the 69 season. The Kansas City Chiefs, again, were the Texans from 60 to 62, moved to Kansas City in 1963, and their head coach is one of the most colorful and well-dressed people in the history of sport, and that's the great Hank Stram.
Whoops.
Hank Stram, yeah. I skipped over the Joe Cap story, and I would like to apologize. Do you mind if I jump back to that just momentarily?
Let's do it.
So we jump back because the picture came up, and my apologies. I'll figure a way to blame Mark at some point in this. All my fault.
I've already received a series of texts.
Well, it's funny because you
lambasting
mentioned Joe Cap, and rightfully so. And then I just got away from the notes because I thought, oh, we've talked about Cap, so we can move on. Joe Cap comes down from Vancouver, where he won Grey Cups and had a great deal of success in Canada. And with the departure of Tarkenton, Cap comes in to play quarterback, and he is an unconventional player. Mark, I think you would agree.
Yes.
Did not use the laces to throw the football.
No. And you look at Joe Cap highlights and you can see a spiral was not high on his priority list.
No, I think it went end to end. But the interesting thing is it generally got there. And also Cap looked like unathletic. He looked like a loaf of bread in his uniform. He was just like this kind of rectangular thing. He did not look athletic at all, but he was great running the football. He really was.
And he was very tough. He could take hit after hit. And, the reason why Bud Grant loved him so much is that he would figure out a way to win. He won 4 Grey Cups up in Canada. He was a quote unquote winner. He really was. Yeah,
he was a winner. And though he did say later on that if I'd have listened to everything that Bud told me to do and done it the way he said, I never would have had any success. Because Bud Grant was so conservative. And Cap was a little bit like Tarkenton. He was nowhere near the thrower of the football Tarkenton was, but he was a guy who was not afraid to pull the ball down and run, and didn't have, not as quick as the smaller Tarkenton, but he was tough, and he had a little shake and bake from time to time. So he was a difficult guy to defense, Joe Cap. So there we go. We jump back to Joe Cap. Now we can jump back ahead to Hank Stram. My apologies for going off. There's the great Hank Stram, whose father was a haberdasher, so this is why he was so well dressed all the time. Hank Stram, Mark,
all the time.
Went to high school in Gary, Indiana. Lew Wallace High School in Gary, Indiana. Who is Lew Wallace? Civil War general.
And I believe he wrote a book or two.
He did write a book or two. The two no one remembers, but the one that we do is Ben-Hur.
How about that?
And I only bring it up because Mark, weren't you involved? Weren't you and Oral Hershiser, the producers of a musical version of Ben-Hur, which delighted audiences for hours at
days.
Orange County Civic Center?
Yes, a multi-million-dollar project. I was not a co-producer. I wish I would have been, to tell you the truth. I think things may have been different. Things may have been different.
Oh, you would have made some changes.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Kidding me? Yeah. I would have trusted the people who actually knew what they were doing. But it was a musical based on Ben-Hur, and I played Sheik Ilderim. So culturally appropriating a sheik. Yeah. And had a song. I saw it. It was a big deal, and it was a spectacularly funded event, which I think Oral Hershiser threw $2 million into this thing. $2 million, and it was going to go to Broadway. Seriously, on my way to Broadway in a big character part. Durka. It was a total Durka time. And man, spectacularly crashed. With all due respect to the families who are maybe still sad about this, it was worse than the Hindenburg.
It's often called the new Coke of theater. In some circles.
Big investment and a spectacular fail.
Okay, all comedy
And
aside.
I'm connected to Hank Stram somehow.
There you are, and Lou Wallace. Hank Stram had never been a head coach up to this point in time. He was an assistant at the University of Miami when he was hired. He had also been an assistant at Notre Dame and SMU. And I have those out of order, and I'll tell you the SMU one in a minute. But they're most importantly at Purdue, where he helped recruit Len Dawson, who will come into our story here in just a few minutes. And there's Len at Purdue, very successful I think two-time Big Ten, all Big Ten at Purdue, and would end up as the quarterback for these Kansas City Chiefs in '69. The reason, and sorry that I said that out of order, but when he was an assistant coach at SMU, and this is part of the reason that he got the job at Kansas City after it was turned down by a couple of other coaches I'll mention in a moment, was because a bench player on that SMU team was Lamar Hunt, the owner of the Dallas Texans / Kansas City Chiefs. But Hunt had actually offered the job to both Bud Wilkinson, who was coaching at Oklahoma, which had been the team of the 50s by far in college football. They were one of the great dynasties of all time, and a New York Giants assistant called Tom Landry, who would end up as the head coach of the NFL team in Dallas. Both of them turned it down, and so Hank Stram takes the gig. Stram's nickname was the Mentor, Mark. Everybody called him the Mentor. He was a great innovator, I formation, the stacked defense, and all of these things, pre-snap motion, all kinds of stuff that you did not see, not only in the NFL, but early on in the AFL as well. I mean, he was as innovative a coach as there ever was. And he
could predict a play. When he became a broadcaster, he could predict a play better than anyone I've ever seen before or since.
Yeah.
Remarkable.
He was amazing.
Just really knew the game.
And we talked about him being a judge. He was a great judge of talent. He had some great scouts too. We're going to talk about one of those in a minute. But I mean, you think about the Hall of Famers. I mentioned Len Dawson, Bobby Bell, Buck Buchanan, Curly Culp, Willie Lanier, Jan Stenerud, Emmett Thomas, Johnny Robinson. Every one of those guys is in the Hall of Fame. And
that is remarkable.
It really is. Stram in the epilogue to this, we'll talk about how Stram gets to the Pro Football Hall of Fame years behind Bud Grant, years after Bud Grant got there. And I think that's a bit unfair. I think Hank Stram still was, if not openly campaigned against, I think there was still some feeling that the AFL success didn't count. Yeah. You know, maybe by the time the merger came along, but the Kansas City team that won, the Dallas Texan team that won an AFL championship, and that first Kansas City team, he wins in 69, but that's a Minnesota team. Maybe they're a bit of an anomaly. So there were a lot of reasons, none of which I think were justified in keeping Hank Stram out of the Hall of Fame as long as they did. I mentioned that he had a great scouting staff, and he did. One of the most important was a guy by the name of Lloyd Wells. Now, one of the things about the AFL, Mark, is it gave a great deal more opportunity to players from historically black colleges and universities. I mentioned some of the Buck Buchanan, Bobby Bell, Willie Lanier, Emmett Thomas, the great Otis Taylor, who we'll talk about a little bit later. And these were guys who were not, and there's Otis, who were not recruited to play in the National Football League, because still at this time, there were unspoken limits to how many players you could have of color on an NFL team. And I thought one of the most interesting things about it is it was either 2, 4, 6, 8. You could never have an uneven number. And you know why, Mark?
Lockers or something like that?
So they couldn't room together.
Gotcha.
They wouldn't room African-American players with white players. Well, that all went out the window in the...
when did that change? Like 94, 95?
Well, depending on the team, maybe. But we'll jump back into that in a moment. I do want to mention about Lloyd Wells that we brought up. In addition to his work as a scout with the Chiefs, He started an East-West All-Star game in Houston for high school players of color, which started his real pipeline to the HBCUs and really helped him when it came to scouting for the Chiefs. He also helped integrate the Houston Cougars basketball team. He got Don Chaney and the great Elvin Hayes. There's the Big E on that team. He also was instrumental in adding Don Lattin to the Texas Western team that started 5 African Americans and beat Adolph Rupp, vitriolic racist, Lily White Kentucky team.
Lily
Fieldhouse.
Lily White.
They were pale. A couple of guys were clear.
They could not be whiter.
No, Pat Riley among players on that team.
That's fun.
On that 66
that's a good one.
Yep.
So,
and also
Lloyd was hugely responsible for the influx of African American talent into the AFL. Essentially,
he had really good relationships with all of these guys in the like coaches and HBCUs, and he had started this all-star game in Houston where he brought all the best players of color. So he was kind of a conduit for everybody.
Just so good.
Also, the famous Otis Taylor story is that it was his job to keep Otis Taylor, to get him away from the NFL. And the NFL had Otis Taylor locked in a hotel room, essentially. They were going to sign him to a contract. And Lloyd Wells was able to break him out through a window. First of all, he talked his way in initially by saying he was a writer for Ebony Magazine, and he was just doing a story on Taylor. And then once he was found out and he was kicked out, he was able to contact Taylor again somehow, and he got him to crawl out a window and took him somewhere and signed him to the Chiefs.
That is a great story.
Isn't it, though?
Lloyd Wells.
There was a lot of that. And sometimes the AFL won and sometimes the NFL won, but that's why they really had to merge.
3 out of 4 times the AFL was winning, at least at the top.
We'll give the NFL credit. On their side, I think it was Tommy Novus out of Texas, the great linebacker who played for the Atlanta Falcons, that he was kind of stolen from the AFL in sort of the same way.
Remarkable.
Yes. Also, and just to finish up with Lloyd Wells, he ended up as part of Muhammad Ali's entourage in the 70s. And so if you watch some classic fights, you will see Lloyd Wells.
Was he in Zaire?
I think he was. Yeah. I think he was there from from the early 70s. What was the Zaire fight? 74?
74, I think.
Yeah.
74.
Okay. Yeah, so Lloyd Wells, and you see him in that great video of the mic'd up Hank Stram in Super Bowl IV. You see Lloyd in the background any number of times. So there you go. There's the Kansas City Chiefs background. Now let's jump to the 69 season, which is really what we're here to talk about. The 69.
Well, again, the title is The Road.
Yes,
we're talking about the road to Super Bowl IV. So it's been a good show. We've talked about the road.
All right, it's more about the road, and I promise everybody, I'm trying to get through it quicker, so it's not like a Merchant Ivory film, and not even generally a bad Merchant Ivory film like Jefferson in Paris or something.
And again, a 25 to 30-year-old reference.
Are either of them alive now, Merchant or Ivory? I don't know. I think
James Ivory and Stephen Merchant, I think.
Ishmael Merchant.
Oh.
Ishmael Merchant, and call me Ishmael Merchant. And
James Ivory.
And James Ivory, absolutely correct. All right, so in 68, didn't take Rod Grant long for the turnaround. Took the job in 67. 68, he has the team in the playoffs. And by 69, he posts the best record in the National Football League, a 12-2 record. This team was dominant. Yeah. It's so funny because every year it seems like from 1961 on, every team that won the NFL championship was the best team in the history of the NFL. I think the NFL might have been kidding themselves there, but this team was pretty damn good. Scored 379 points, only gave up 133 points.
Both first in the NFL, right? They were first in offense, first in defense.
Yeah, in a 14-game season, they scored 50 or more points in 3 games. They won 12 straight. They lost their first and last game of the season. That was the longest streak since 1934. They only gave up more than 14 points once, only once, in the game 1 loss to Fran Tarkenton and the New York Giants.
They lost by 1 point, by the way, on a last second. It was a comeback by Tarkenton. They had that game under control.
They gave up 14 points in the fourth quarter.
Right.
That defense had something to prove after that. And their only other loss was their final game of the season. And guess who they lost to?
49ers.
Nope. Our old friend Norm Van Brocklin's Atlanta Falcons.
Oh my gosh, that's right.
Yep.
Van Brocklin.
Yep. So this was a dominant team. If you watch the history of that year, I mean, they beat the crap out of people. They could win high scoring, low scoring, didn't matter.
And I think, John, across the season, they scored they allowed 130 points, right? In a 14-game season.
Points, yes.
That's under 10 a game.
Right.
Under 10. It's remarkable.
And they gave up 24 in the first game.
Yes. That was smothering defense and a very high-powered offense.
Yeah, and they lost that last game. Now, they had already clinched in that last game to Atlanta. They lost 10-3, and, they were playing it really close to the best. Now, let's jump to the Chiefs. They were 11-3 in the regular season. 2 of those losses to the Oakland Raiders, who, remember, they were only 2 years removed from being AFL champions. Points for 359, only 177 points given up by that defense. So they're only giving up around, 11.75 points per game or something?
Right.
I believe less than 12 points a game. So they're pretty damn good on both sides of the football as well. Little bit rockier road for them. They started 2-0 and lost Lenny Dawson to a knee injury. Their backup quarterback, Jackie Lee. There's Jackie.
He looks overwhelmed in that picture. If you're watching if you're listening to the podcast, the picture of Jackie Lee sort of indicates that he's afraid.
Okay, I'm going to say this about Jackie Lee. One of only 20 men to play every AFL season from 1960 to 1969. He started with Houston. He backed up and split time with George Blanda, and then he ended up in Kansas City. And oh my gosh, look at this. Here's his chance in his last season in the AFL. He's going to be the starting quarterback for the Kansas City Chiefs. And he went down with a broken ankle in that week 3 game, and which was a loss to Cincinnati. 24-19. 2 quarterbacks played for that Cincinnati team, Mark. Greg Cook, who would go down with an injury, and his injury would lead to the West Coast offense, because the offensive coordinator at that point in time for Cincinnati was Bill Walsh. And the other quarterback that Greg Cook split time with, Mark, was
a Bill Walsh protege as well. Sam Weish, who was a quarterback for the Bengals, later became an assistant coach for that Bill Walsh 49er team, and then a coach of his own, and got his team to the Super Bowl. But yeah, Sam Weish, and you're right about Greg Cook. Greg Cook was this exceptional,
he was a great talent.
Could run, had a gun. And once they didn't have that, that's when Bill Walsh decided to invent an offense with Sid Gilliam's help and I
think it's Gilman.
Influence. Thank you. Sid Gilman and Paul Brown's influence, both of their influences, but really made up an offense that you could dink and dunk your way down the field. You didn't have to have a big arm.
Maybe the 2 coaches who have the most effect on the game still, that were historic coaches in the NFL, all apologies to George Halas and Vince Lombardi, Paul Brown and Sid Gilliam. Gilman. God, now you got me doing it.
I know. It's because of Jim Gilliam and my deep dive with the Dodgers.
And John Gilliam, the quarterback. Anyway, plenty of Gilliams.
Yes,
but
we're digging holes right now.
We really are.
We're digging Gilliam holes.
We're digging Gilliam holes. Now for the Chiefs, again, now they've lost their starting quarterback. They've lost their second string quarterback. They have a second-year player named Mike Livingston who comes in. And Mike Livingston, who ends up putting together a pretty decent career as a sometime starter and backup in the NFL. Actually, his glory was this year. They won 5 straight with Mike Livingston at quarterback. And basically, what everybody said about Mike is that he knew what he knew, and he knew what his limitations were, and he knew he couldn't get that team beat. With that defense and the talent they had, both running the football and catching the football, if he could just not make mistakes, he didn't. They won 5 straight.
That's fun. That's my philosophy playing ping pong against much more skilled players. Just return it. Just return it. Don't try and put spin on it. Don't try and do a power shot.
English.
No. Just return it. Just you let them make the mistake. That was Mike Livingston's philosophy.
Yep, and worked well for Livingston.
5-0.
All right, we've got both of our teams to the postseason now. Let's talk about what happened in the postseason, starting with the Vikings, who we talked about weather before. So for the Vikings, getting home field advantage was a big deal, and it certainly paid off for them in the playoffs. Starting out against Southern California's own Los Angeles Rams, Coached by George Allen, notoriously bad in postseason, not a losing record in the regular season as a head coach, a great head coach. But Mark, this is your era in LA. You know about George Allen being a head coach of the Rams. They were a very, very good football team, and they just they had no success in the playoffs.
No, they didn't. And actually, when Chuck Knox took over too, they had more success, but they still couldn't get to the big one. But I think George Allen had maybe 9 playoff games. I think won 2. I think he's 2-7.
Yeah, he won 2 over Green Bay and Dallas the same year, 1972. There's the only 2. And the only 2 he lost one. He lost as a divisional playoff in Washington, with Washington in Minnesota as well. And he's going to lose this game. It's 11 degrees at kickoff. Minnesota loses the turnover battle in this game. The Rams on 4 first half possessions scored 3 times, 2 of them on Roman Gabriel touchdown passes. They led 17-7 at the half. The most spectacular thing about this, Mark, is they scored in the first quarter. The only touchdown scored against that Minnesota defense all year in the first quarter.
Wow. Interesting.
The utter dominance of that team is just ridiculous.
But they had first game jitters a little bit.
They did have first game jitters. And it also should be pointed out that defensively, you mentioned it before, that was a hell of a Rams defense.
Yeah, that was a great Rams team. You know, they had to deal with the Packers in the mid 60s. They had to deal with, the Colts and the Vikings in the late 60s. And they were always right there. That was a great football team that just couldn't quite,
Yeah, they reminded me of what, like from the 70s, maybe it's like the Houston Oilers.
Someone always competitive, someone, kind of every now and then get into the championship game.
Right.
A team that never went away, but never quite could.
Yeah, never could take the next step. And,
the Houston Oilers were a very good team, but they had, there's Oakland, there's Pittsburgh, there's Miami.
Right. So bad time to be them. The Vikings outscore their timing.
Owned by Bud Adams in the era we're talking.
To quote Spinal Tap, they fucked up the timing. I got no timing. They're outscored 16-3 in the second half. Joe Cap running the football quite a bit. They started rolling him out and making the fearsome foursome chase him and basically just wore them down. I bring it up. They end up winning the game 23-20 because halftime adjustments were a big reason why they won this game. A couple of games later, they're not going to make any halftime adjustments, and it's going to cost them. In the NFL championship game, 8 degrees versus Cleveland. So, or as they call it in Minnesota, springtime. And to your point earlier, the Cleveland Browns had lost the NFL championship game the year before, 34-0. Minnesota sort of scored 4 minutes into the game, touchdown pass to Gene Washington. And
there's Gene Washington.
Mark.
Yeah.
For those of you listening,
I love Gene Washington.
I
love Gene Washington.
We have a photo and a football card of Gene Washington with the 49ers, who is not
great.
The Gene Washington that we're talking about.
Excuse me?
It is a different Gene Washington. So nice job slipping in. I told you I'd get you in there, so I brought up the Jim Marshall wrong way, but it wasn't enough.
It's never enough.
Give Mark an inch.
It's never enough.
He'll take a mile.
Yes. I'll take the length of a rope.
In any case, the other Gene Washington and the San Francisco talk is now making the crawl. Nice job, Jeff. The other Gene Washington catch it 4 minutes in, touchdown pass. Cleveland turns the ball over 3 times, and the Vikings win 27-7. And in their 9th year of existence, the Minnesota Vikings are in the Super Bowl. Still fastest expansion team, right? No, Carolina.
I don't think that was 9 years, though. Or what? Oh, you're right. Well,
61, 69.
And 95 to 03.
So it might have been 8 years. I probably should have checked this ahead of time.
I think it's actually the same amount of time. It's in their 9th year. Carolina was in their 9th year.
Interesting. Okay. Well, there you go. But so that's, that's pretty remarkable, really. And when you look at where they were under Van Brocklin and what Bud Grant was able to do.
Very quickly, too. He got there in 67, like you said. And by
in 68, they're in the playoffs.
Yeah. And 69, they're in the Super Bowl.
They benefited because he was in the same division as the Bears in their worst period ever. The Detroit Lions in their worst period ever, which means any year of the NFL starting.
Actually, the Lions were relatively competitive.
No, they were pretty good, actually.
Turns out, but just relatively competitive.
Right. On any given Sunday, they could beat you, but they weren't going anywhere beyond that. And I don't think they made the playoffs. And
I think they snuck in 70, but
maybe.
Yeah. Greg Landry. Remember him? Greg Landry.
I do very much. Yeah.
Way off. Let's talk about the 1970 Detroit Lions.
But the point I was going to make is they also caught the Green Bay Packers at the end of the dynasty.
It's true. So they were fortunate with their, grouping.
Yep. By the way, the AFL wanted to put a team in Milwaukee, and Vince Lombardi put a stop to that because, they played in County Stadium.
Right.
And basically he signed an extended lease to play in County Stadium, which I believe they did well into the early 90s, if I'm not correct.
Yeah. They split time.
Yeah, which is so weird when you think Lambeau is this
iconic
venue
place
of all venues, and dumpy old County Stadium in Milwaukee that the last time the only other time it's ever mentioned is when the Braves moved there and left Boston, and 2 million people came to see baseball games, and it was the greatest number ever. And then it's never, ever mentioned again until Vince Lombardi signs this thing, all these years.
And then
later.
as a footnote, to their scheduling, you see these asterisks, Milwaukee. What's that? I was always so confused with that.
All right, so let's jump into Kansas City's postseason. They open up against the defending AFL champion New York Jets and our good friend Joe Namath, who Mark disparaged earlier in the show as the worst Hall of Fame quarterback.
I did. Most overrated.
33 degrees.
I think
you may not be wrong. I have to be honest.
Exactly.
33 degrees, swirling winds at Shea. It was a terrible place to play in wintertime when the wind blew. If you're watching, you can see it's shaped like a bowl. The wind would blow in and basically just swirl around. It just created a vortex so that from one play to the next, Namath said in an interview I saw, from one play to the next, you didn't know, when you broke the huddle, the wind could be at your back. And by the time you snapped the ball, it was blowing in your face. So
I think they designed it that way because they knew eventually Willie Mays would come back to New York, and they wanted to make him feel at home.
It all comes down to Mays just being screwed, doesn't it?
I mean, you could really distill a lot of the problems in this country to the city of Dallas, and to people trying to screw Willie Mays. I mean, come on,
that should be the next deep dive. All of our problems come down to these things. It was 6-3 in the fourth quarter, a 6-3 Kansas City lead, and the most important drive of the game really was New York drove down and had first and goal because of a penalty call on the 1 yard line, on the Kansas City 1 yard line, and the Chiefs defense held them to a field goal.
Wow.
On that. Yeah. Because that would have won the football game. In the meantime, Otis Taylor is on the sidelines. We mentioned Otis earlier, and he's drawing up a play on the ground for Len Dawson and saying, here's what we need to do. Da, 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 da. And he makes a catch on the sidelines. And I ask you, go back and look at the film. He's out of bounds. If there's any replay, this doesn't happen. And maybe we have a New York Jet or Oakland Raider, Minnesota Vikings Super Bowl, an Oakland Raider Vikings Super Bowl 7 years too soon.
It goes to your point, John, about how franchises and the people that support them are truly punished. There's a price to pay. We talked about the Miami Dolphins. Those fans will never see a championship again. We
Not in their lifetime.
27 championships of the Yankees, and those fans
straight to hell. Lake of Fire.
Go to the Lake of Fire.
Yep.
And think about the Jets. They were a half an inch from winning that game on the goal line. They were robbed of that touchdown drive.
Because did you see the video of it?
Yes.
He's out of bounds.
And they were that close. And look at what's happened to the Jets since.
Mm-hmm.
To pay for what happened, to be part of an iconic moment that transcends the game and perhaps even American culture or defines American culture at some point.
Sure does.
And there's just a price to pay.
There is. You can't have everything.
It started the very next year,
Where would you put it? You can't have everything. Where would you put it? It's one of my favorite Stephen Wright lines. You can't have everything. Where would you put it? Almost as good as I put instant coffee in a microwave oven. Went backwards in time.
He had some doozies.
I always mentioned, and I'm going to go off track and tell it here.
Here we go.
Gator Growl. I know, because it's what we do. Gator Growl. Stephen Wright comes out, does the opening joke, and it's Gator Growl. There are 80,000 people in Florida Field, and 79,830 didn't get the joke, and I was among the 170 that did. But he comes on stage, ladies and gentlemen, Stephen Wright. Two babies born next to each other in a hospital, placed into bassinets next to each other by a turn of fate, as 80-year-old dying men are placed in the same hotel room next to each other, never having met in between. And one turns to the other and says, "So what do you think?" I think that joke is damn near perfect. And people around me, I'm laughing, and people around me are just looking at me, like I'm a Democrat in Houston. It's just like, what in hell is
you're a Democrat in Gainesville? Might as well be the same thing.
Well, no, actually, blue city in a red
state. True.
Yeah.
Good call.
It's college town.
It is a college town.
People are educated. It's college town. All right, moving on.
All right. What's next?
The AFL championship game. And it is fitting that the last game in the American Football League is between the best rivalry in the AFL, the Chiefs and the Raiders. Those games were war.
Yeah. Legendary.
You had the Chiefs, which, those guys had to wear houndstooth jackets and black slacks, and the jackets had a Kansas City logo, and they all wore ties, and they all looked great. And the Raiders were, just win, baby, looked like a biker gang at any point in time. But it was an amazing rivalry. But, Mark, it was a bit hammer and nail at this point, because the Chiefs had lost 2 of the 3 games that they lost that year to the Raiders.
Sure.
And they'd lost 7 of 8.
Wow.
To the Raiders in that period of time.
So they had won the war occasionally because they were in Super Bowl I, the Chiefs.
Yep.
And they, would eventually get here and had success in between. But they basically lost all the battles.
I think really between the Super Bowl I, the next season, which was 67, Super Bowl I, 66 season, 67 to this point in time, they lost all but one game that they played them.
See, that's remarkable.
Yeah.
That's remarkable.
It really is. The Raiders, by the way, had come off beating Houston, who one of the best teams in the AFL. They won, I believe, the first AFL championship game.
I think so.
Boy, talk a team that's lost to history is those early Houston Oilers teams, which had some great players. But they were a shell of themselves. Oakland had beat them 56-7 the week before. The game is 7-7 at the half.
It's at Arrowhead, right?
Yep. It's at Oakland Alameda Coliseum.
Oh, that's right. Oakland Alameda.
We just saw it.
Wow.
Yeah.
At Alameda, how about that?
Coliseum. 7-7 at the half. Kansas City scored with 3:24 left in the third. They drove 75 yards and scored. They shut out the Raiders. Excuse me. I'm checking my notes. I want to make sure that I get this in order so we get the right pictures up. Score 3:24 left in the third quarter to make it 14-7. They shut out the Raiders for the rest of the game because, again, great halftime adjustments by Kansas City, which they were always known for. And they knocked Daryl LaMonica out of the game, the Mad Bomber. George Blanda, who I believe was on those Houston teams that won
I think you're right.
The championship in 1960, comes into the game. At this point, how old is Blanda?
174.
174 the day before we send out.
No, I mean, George Blanda was ancient. I mean, just when I started really checking into the NFL, which was
he was about 43 at this point, wasn't he? He's about 43 years old.
Roughly, yeah. And so in the 1970 season, he's 44, and not only kicking game-winning field goals for the Oakland Raiders, but coming in and replacing LaMonica and winning games as a quarterback as well.
Oh, it was either 71 or 72, I think, too, where he had like a really cool, great run.
I think it was 70, but it could have
Was
been
it 70? It might have been 70.
I think it was, and it was in a remarkable run as a quarterback and as a place kicker at 44, whatever it was.
Anyway, and I'm sorry I burgered that at the end. What ends up happening is Kansas City beats Oakland 17-7. They should have left a few of those points from the 56-7 beating of Houston and let them hang around for this game. So in the last game in the American Football League, after losing 7 of 8 to that season, Kansas City finally defeats Oakland, and it's just a great cap to what is a remarkable David and Goliath story when it comes to the AFL and the NFL. Now, mitigated somewhat by the fact that David owned a small country, monetarily speaking, and Goliath, is all hat, no cattle in a lot of respects. It was Goliath. So that brings us to we've traveled the road. Mark, can we just move on and talk about Monday's show? Or
I think we should talk about the game.
Let's dive into Super Bowl IV, shall we? January 11th, 1970. You remember this one at all?
I don't.
No memory of it. Nope. Tulane Stadium in New Orleans. First Super Bowl in New Orleans. The first two had been in the first one in Los Angeles and 2 and 3 in Miami. This is the first New Orleans Super Bowl. It would become a regular.
It would be, yeah. And Tulane too, right? Before the Superdome was built, they had a few.
Yeah, they did. They did. They have one more, I know, and I think the Superdome was supposed to have been finished and wasn't for the next one. And it was either one of because there were a couple of weirdo stadium things when you look, because most Super Bowls, there's like a handful of stadiums that they've all been held in. And but there are 2 Tulanes and a Rice stadium. And I can never remember if Rice in Houston, and I don't know why the Astrodome was not.
So I think the other Tulane was the Vikings were back in Tulane. They played the Steelers, I believe.
Yeah, it was either that one, and then the Miami, Minnesota one, I think might have been Rice Stadium.
Gosh.
Yeah.
See, all Minnesota needed was a normal Super Bowl stadium to play in.
Yeah, I think Tulane, wasn't that also Miami and Dallas, Super Bowl VI? Because that was an outdoor dumpy stadium, if I remember the video. That's the first Super Bowl I remember.
That was an outdoor dumpy game as well.
Yeah, that one,
that was ugly.
About as bad as this one that we're about to talk about. Maybe a little less entertaining, quite frankly.
I would say so.
Anyway, ticket prices were $15. Wouldn't that be nice? It was, as I said earlier, the last AFL-NFL championship game. There had been a massive amount of rain before the game. Our game time temperature was 55 degrees, but it was a chilly 55 degrees because it was damp. The field was very damp, and if you watch the video of it, the field just looks horrible. Just looks like my lawn right now. Just garbage. Some interesting fun notes. CBS had the game at that point as they were jumping back and forth at that point. I think it was CBS, NBC for a while until they started bidding on them. The first game was televised by both CBS and NBC, but your announcers were the great Jack Buck and Pat Summerall when he was a color announcer and not a play-by-play guy.
Yeah.
How about that? Do you know who the sideline reporters were?
I do not, Johnny.
Frank Gifford and Jack Whitaker.
Wow.
Yep. Frank Gifford had the Kansas City locker room, and Jack Whitaker had the Minnesota locker room. Now the most interesting part of this entire Super Bowl, in my mind, 2 most interesting things are the national anthem and the halftime show. The national anthem was played on trumpet by Doc Severinsen. There's the great Doc Severinsen, probably gacked to the gills. And the national anthem itself was read as the poem that it was written, Mark. I mean,
it was recited.
That's right. There's strict constructionalists probably enjoy this by actor Pat O'Brien.
Yeah, so he would read the national. Oh, say, can you see?
Oh, say, can you see? By the dawns. It's bizarre. I recommend you watch the damn thing.
Beyond surreal. I don't think anyone would kneel for that because they would be too much in shock.
Yeah.
Watching it. They'd be just standing with their mouths agape. They'd forget to kneel.
Wow. Didn't Pat O'Brien play Newt Rockney and Newt Rockney All-American?
with Ronald Reagan.
Yeah.
See, there you go.
Yeah, so there's another note. There's way too much Notre Dame in this show already, so let's move on. Also memorable, if you watch the America's game or the NFL video on it, is one of the parts of the prior to the game, they had a hot air balloon with a Viking in it that was supposed to, rise from the field as if, Phoenix from the ashes or whatever.
Was there a tragedy that happened?
No, we couldn't get it airborne and basically just dragged across the field and then ended up throwing the gondolier, whatever the thing hangs underneath a hot air balloon. Because if you ride one of those, you're a moron in my mind. And just slammed him into the bleachers with people scattering. It's like Le Mans in 55. And if you don't know that.
No, that's rough. That's rough.
Yeah. Also, this game really famous, more than anything, famous for Hank Stram being wired for sound. And I saw an interview with Steve Sable. And Stram, his dad, Ed Sable, started NFL Films and approached Stram and thought he would be fun to mic him because Stram was a very colorful figure and said a lot of fun stuff. And Stram basically said, yeah, how much are you going to pay me? And he's like, he said, "What are you? Coin of the realm? It's the coin of the what's the coin of the realm?" And I guess Ed Sable's like, "What are you talking about?" He goes, Stram wants money. Stram wants money. And I think he started with like $100, and Stram's like, "I wouldn't cover 2 weeks worth of my dry cleaning." So they ended up paying him $1,000 to get mic'd for that game.
And by the way, $1,019 early $1970 is worth what now?
$2.7 million.
So that's a pretty good day's work.
Yeah, just to be mic'd,
3 hours of work. Yeah, just to do what you normally do. You're not doing anything extra.
Right. Great story by Len Dawson, where he talks about the fact that nobody on the team knew. Stram didn't tell anybody he was mic'd, which is odd because given what you see from mics back then, I'm surprised he didn't have to wear a helmet with like a backpack.
Yeah.
Because lavs were not tiny little things like they are now.
But they weren't wireless, so he had a wire sticking out of him. So at some point, someone must have thought.
I guess they weren't paying very much attention. But Dawson said he'd come to the sidelines, and normally when he'd come to the sidelines, Stram would say to him, "Lenny, what are you thinking here? What do you have in mind? What are you looking at doing?" Because back then, quarterbacks called all their own plays, the vast majority of them, and Dawson said, this time he'd come to the sidelines and Stram would be like, "I think run this. You should run this." And he's like, "Wow, this is really, he must be so uptight. He's like telling me what to run." And then he realized later it's being taped, so he's going to look like a genius.
Right.
When the film came out. So, and they didn't find out. The Chiefs did not know. No one told them until they actually saw the film of the game months and months later.
And
it was March or April.
Yeah. It is iconic.
Oh, it's great. We'll talk a little bit about it.
It's the memory of Super Bowl IV, at least for most people.
And thank God they did, because otherwise there ain't much memorable about
walking up and down the side.
Should point this out about Len Dawson that we mentioned as well. Lenny Dawson, who had, I think, come into the NFL in 1957 and had beat around. This was a triumph for him this year, Dawson, who will end up being the MVP of the Super Bowl. But he had a rough year. I'd mentioned the injury, which kept him out for 6 games during the season. His father passed away in the middle of the season. And then a gambling scandal came out the week of the Super Bowl. I think 4 days from the game, that he was implicated in some sort of gambling scandal. Now, the whole thing turned out to be nothing, but it took him a couple of days to get it resolved, and just put a little bit of extra stress on Dawson. There are a lot of conspiracy theories as to how this story came out, when it came out, and was it gamblers themselves putting Dawson's name out there? Because it was a guy that he was familiar with, but he'd only had a couple of conversations with, who turned out to be a gambler. And was this just some way for gamblers to get an edge on the game? But Dawson hadn't done anything wrong. Len Dawson, generally considered one of the really good guys in the history of the NFL. But a tough season for Len Dawson. It wouldn't be a tough game for Len Dawson.
Was not a tough game.
All right, so let's jump into this here. In the first quarter, and I watched this game in its entirety on a black and white kinescope that I've said, as I told you, somebody restored. So it was really interesting to watch. And Vikings moving the football. Actually, both teams early moving the football well, but not, it was a bend, don't break situation, which is interesting, giving both of these defenses were essentially, we're just going to stop you defenses. They weren't really bend, don't break defenses. The Vikings were able to move the ball on the first drive, but they stalled and had to punt. The Chiefs were able to drive were able to get a little bit of a drive together. I think a total of 42 yards. But they had to settle for a 48-yard field goal attempt by Jan Stenerud, the Hall of Fame kicker. Still the only kicker, right, in the Hall of Fame. Has anybody else gotten in since?
I don't know, but Vinatieri will.
He will. Yeah, there's no doubt about it. I think still. But anyway, so he kicks a 48-yard field goal, which is a record in the Super Bowl. By the way, I have a book that has Super Bowl records and about the game and what records were set in that game. And I looked at this and I go, how is this game not more remembered? It set like 100 records, and I thought it was the fourth game. So you're going to be setting a lot of records. Right. That was a record, however, the 48-yard field goal. That would stand for 24 years.
Wow.
Until Steve Christie for Buffalo in the second Buffalo
shellacking
by Dallas, Super Bowl 28, I believe, kicked a 54-yarder. Let's remember, though, in the Georgia Dome, he kicked a 54-yarder. Jan Stenerud kicked a 48-yarder on a bad field on a damp day at 55 degrees. It's a much better kick in my mind.
No doubt.
In fact, the fact that Steve Christie will allow his name to be mentioned, I think says a lot about him.
It does. And I think, goes to the character not only of John, but of the rest of that Buffalo Bills team, which is why they couldn't get over the hump.
Second quarter, Stenerud ends up being big as well. Kicks a 32 and a 25-yard field goal. But, it's 9-0 at this point. And this is anybody's football game.
Sure.
Both teams looked a little tight. But also, let's remember, these are two of the best defenses in football.
Yeah.
Kansas City moves the ball on their next possession after their field goal. John Henderson of the Vikings, the wide receiver, had fumbled the ball. Kansas City got it back. But then they get intercepted on the 7. I mean, it's just Paul Krause, the guy I mentioned, the safety who was in the Hall of Fame, intercepts the ball at the Minnesota 7. Well, then the big moment that really is where this game changed was Minnesota's Charlie West fumbled a punt. Kansas City gets the ball on the 19-yard line. There's Charlie. Sorry, Charlie. On the 19-yard line. And this is the famous, if you watch the game, the 65 toss power trap.
Yes.
It's the Spider Y banana of its day. It's basically just a counterplay to Mike Garrett. And I should have mentioned Mike Garrett, the running back and future pretty successful athletic director at USC for a while.
Heisman Trophy winner.
Yep. But this is the famous with Hank Stram actually calling a play. He sends Gloucester Richardson, one of the great running backs for Kansas City, in with the play 65 toss power trap. And Garrett gets into the end zone. It's 16-0 at the half. And at this point, Dawson said it. They're going to score 16 points and a half on our defense. I don't think so. But still, it's a 3-possession game, true, but you have a whole half. Let's jump to the halftime for just a minute because I said it much more exciting than the game. The Southern University Marching Band, Doc Severinsen, Lionel Hampton, other jazz musicians. Remember,
like that.
It's in New Orleans, first one in New Orleans, and a lot of jazz being played. We're all in favor of that. But somewhere somebody decided, you know what the kids like with all the football. It's too cold for scantily clad cheerleaders. Reenactments.
It's always a New York guy. It's always, no matter
it's the same guy.
Where in the it is, it's the same.
Always the same guy.
It scantily clad cheerleaders. So what did that guy decide to do?
A reenactment of the Battle of New Orleans.
Excuse me?
They bring cannon out on the field, guys in full dress as if British and American Army, and they have this reenactment. There's smoke from the cannons all over the field, guys dropping like flies as they're just ripped apart by actual cannon. Yeah, it is one of the most bizarre. They killed 2-3 dozen people just for entertainment's sake. I tell you what, bring us a couple poor, blow them the hell up. It won't matter.
No one will care.
Listen, if Scully says you can burn down the stadium with the lousy ass Dodger fans in it, we can kill 24 people for a halftime. Well, I tell you, my favorite Super Bowl was clearly Super Bowl IV. I tell you, the game itself, not much happened, but in a reenactment of the Battle of New Orleans, which, by the way, occurred after the end of the War of 1812, and there was no point for it whatsoever. Speaking of no points, I don't see any points on the board for the Vikings. However, love that game because they had a reenactment of the Battle of New Orleans and actually killed a couple of dozen people, and Scully loves that.
Why? Just created this huge narrative about one of the most iconic good guys in the history of any sport.
Oh, Vin Scully had the dark side of Vin Scully. That should be
dark side of Vin Scully.
A recurring character to this show is the dark side of Vin Scully. So we should have Vin come on and comment on any sort of sporting things going on. You know what I'd do in that bubble? Anybody who stepped outside, I'd blow him apart with an AK.
You would, Vin, yourself? You would?
I tell you, I'd like nothing more than to stand outside the door and to see one of those overpaid kids walk out the door. I'd cut him in half with an AK. Hey, how do you like them apples?
Wow. So I want to ask you how Vin Scully called this element of the halftime show, because at the end of it, I'm told that they get the reenactor playing Andrew Jackson, who was the general and won the battle, the meaningless battle, as you referred to earlier.
Yeah.
And they carried him off on their shoulders, that, you know, as the New Orleans hero that he clearly is to many people. So what was Vin's call of Andrew Jackson being walked out of the stadium on the shoulders of the victorious, you know, soldiers underneath him?
And there we have it, the final of the Battle of New Orleans, with our score: the American Army 36, the British nothing. And there's the head coach, Andrew Jackson, being carried off the field. A little bit later, Jackson will get drunk and murder a couple of his slaves.
Oh my goodness, I can't believe we're unearthing all of this tape and this material that
the dark side of Vin Scully
heretofore has yet to been discovered. My goodness gracious.
I tell you, I had a couple of rums with Jean Lafitte, and he said, I tell you, Jackson likes winning a battle, but he likes nothing more than murdering one of his slaves.
Oh, my gosh. All right. There it is.
16-0 moving into the third quarter after the most bizarre halftime.
Triple E on this show.
What's that?
A triple E for implicit on this show. But
yeah, I'm sure we'll be cancel culture is all, you know,
up in arms.
Oh my God. Are you kidding me? Yes. This show is offensive to me and the other 4 people listening. Well, 3 of you are in the same fucking room. Jesus. All right, third quarter, 16-0 Kansas City.
Third quarter.
On the first possession, their first possession of the second half, the Vikings drive 69 yards and score a touchdown. Dave Osborne, longtime Viking, tough running back, Dave Osborne, on a 4-yard touchdown run. And they're talking on the broadcast, Mark, as you can imagine, what are the most cliche things that you can say at this time? Boy, I tell you, Kansas City left some points on the board there. The 48-yard field goal, but those other 2 drives, you know, those should have been touchdowns. And boy, maybe they're going to regret that.
Pat Summerall and Jack Buck, couple of hacks.
Cap, there's the ball to Dave Osborne. Vikings are in the end zone, I tell you, Pat. Chiefs are gonna be upset about the points they left on the board. Yeah, I tell you what, they're gonna be madder than Jackson without a slave to murder. All right, so Kansas City gets the ball on the next
third time.
Well, comedy comes in threes. Kansas City gets the ball on the kickoff, though. 6-play, 82-yard drive, and this one again is famous, Mark. If you watch the NFL films, it's the great Otis Taylor touchdown.
Yeah.
One of the things I need to point out is I talked about halftime adjustments that the Vikings had made some really great ones against, particularly against the Rams in that divisional playoff game. Joe Kapp even talks about the fact they didn't do anything at halftime of this game. They're down 16-0, and they're he said he's given the offense hell. We got to get better, but they're not making any adjustments. And Bud Grant says later, we didn't have a sophisticated passing attack. The things that we really, really needed to do, we shouldn't have. Now, I'll get the statistics on the game. They've passed a lot more than they threw. I don't think that was necessarily the problem, but Cap says I should have thrown more on first down and all of this. But I think the bottom line is they just didn't make any adjustments. And I think what really hurt them is then they went down and drove and scored and thought, okay, we're back in this thing.
Here we go.
9-point game, lots of time at this point. And like I said, they had moved the ball some. They just weren't, it was a bend, don't break situation. But then Kansas City, 6 plays, 82 yards. Otis Taylor catches an out pass at about 10 or 11 yards, breaks the tackle of Irshel Maccabee. And then Carl Kasulki's kind of breaks the tackle of Carl Kasulki down near the end zone, I think about the 15. And we have a 41-yard touchdown pass. Should be pointed out that Carl Kasulki is well known because in a boy, here cancel culture is going to jump all over us. Now I'm quoting is the famous where Hank Stram says Kasulki's running around like a Chinese fire drill out there. They don't know what's going on. They were so confused. It's a culturally inappropriate thing to say. It is what he said. And sadly, Carl Kasulki, we talked about this, and you can see if you're watching on the YouTube now, is a couple of years later, he's paralyzed, I believe, in a car accident. And so he was
and kind of at the height of his career, right?
He was he was a very good player.
Yeah,
he would have been, they had Kraus and Kasulki, and they bring in I think Bobby Bryant was there already. I mean, they had really good secondary, but unfortunately, he won't be with them in 73 when they get back to a Super Bowl,
right?
Because he is paralyzed. All right, so that gets us to the fourth quarter. It's 23-7 in favor of Kansas City, and essentially the competitive phase of Super Bowl IV is over. Dawson was right. 16 points for that Viking offense to try to score against that defense.
Right.
Joe Cap leaves with a separated shoulder. Aaron Brown falls on him, separates his shoulder. And that happens to be the last play that he ever has as a Minnesota Viking. Gary Quazzo comes into the game to quarterback, who's a name that bounces around in the 60s and early 70s as a backup, a couple of different places. The last play offensively for them is an interception. Quazzo intercepted by Emmett Thomas, the great defensive back and Hall of Famer, who, by the way, will be voted into the Hall of Fame with two guys that he coached, which are Darryl Green and Art Monk.
Wow.
Because he coached for Washington at that point, directly coaching Darryl Green as a defensive coach and Art Monk. They all three went in at the same time. For 31 years, he was an assistant in the National Football League. He just retired a year and a half, maybe 2 years ago. But one of the great defensive coordinators, one of the great names ever.
Wow.
Yeah, Emmett Thomas is just one of those lifers who was good at everything he did in the NFL. So they hold them scoreless. 23-7 is the end. Here are your final numbers on it. For yards, Kansas City 273 to 239. This is the big one. For rushing, I mentioned the Cap was saying, we didn't throw enough on first down. No, the problem was you couldn't run the football. They had 67 yards on 19 carries. Kansas City ran 42 times for 151 yards in the game.
Wow.
172 passing yards to Minnesota. Kansas City 122. But here's the story. What'll kill you, Mark? What's the thing that'll kill you in big games? Turnovers. 5-1 in favor of Kansas City. And that really was the story of that Super Bowl and their inability to make adjustments. And again, I think in hindsight, Cap thinking they needed to throw more on first down. I don't think that was it at all. I think they needed to figure out a better way to run. The stacked defense of Kansas City that I mentioned earlier was a problem for them. They went head up on nose guard, went head up on the center, or they played a defensive tackle as a nose guard, head up on the center. They put the linebackers directly behind the defensive lineman, was not how things worked in the NFL. You run a 4-3 defense. They're in the gaps. This made it a lot harder for the offensive line of the Vikings. The defensive linemen could basically just occupy the linemen, and the linebackers could then make a lot of tackles. Also want to point out that they, I I believe there were 9 African Americans starting on the defense for that Kansas City Chief team, which was never going to be the case in the NFL at that point in time. Willie Lanier was the first African American middle linebacker, because that bullshit that we listened to for years, it couldn't be quarterback or middle linebacker. African American player doesn't think
the brains.
I don't have the brain for that.
Defense.
Load of crap. Willie Lanier, the Hall of Famer at middle linebacker, but they never were able to make any sort of adjustments. Joe Kapp, as I mentioned, last game he ever played for the Minnesota Vikings, which is it would have been such a different 1970s had Joe Kapp, because Tarkenton wouldn't have come back. Essentially, I don't think Tarkenton would have come. I don't think he would have stayed in New York, but I don't know that he would have come back. He is in a contract dispute and ends up moving to New England, where he plays a couple of years in New England as a Patriot. They're really, really bad then. Jim Plunkett comes in, Kapp's out of football. And famously, Joe Kapp, beyond that, the thing he's probably most remembered for is he's the head coach of the Cal Bears in the famous The Band's on the Field, where Kevin Moen scores off Mark Harmon is the kicker for Stanford. And I played high school football against him in Northern Virginia, I should point out. I believe he's a dentist.
You love Mark Harmon. You love him.
I do.
Think he's one of you think he's one of the best actors of our time?
It's not the same Mark Harmon. It's not. It's the different Mark Harmon. The other one was a quarterback. Yeah, I would have thought. Weren't you at UCLA with Mark Harmon?
Well, yeah.
At the same time in the late 60s?
I don't know. I think he may have been a little bit.
No, I think he's like 72, so he's a couple of years older than you. Here's kind of the epilogue for the teams. For Kansas City, it was really the good times were essentially over. After Super Bowl IV, they only, between 1969 and 1990, 1970 and 1990, they only made 2 playoff appearances.
Wow.
1971 and 86.
One of them was against the Dolphins in that longest game ever on Christmas Day, where the Dolphins started their run. That was 1971. They got to the Super Bowl that year, lost, but then they went the next 2. But that was a great game, and Kansas City had their chances to win that game.
Should have won it, probably.
And they really should have many, many times over. And and then the next time after 71 was 86, and that was it for 10 years.
Those were the only 2 seasons after the Super Bowl season that Kansas City had double-digit wins.
That's tremendously weird.
Yeah, and it really kept, I think, Hank Stram out of the Hall of Fame for a long time. Yeah. Because, again, now we're coming into the most recognizable period of the NFL because of television in the 70s, and his run's essentially over. He spends a couple of crap years in New Orleans, not necessarily all due to him. He comes in there and Archie Manning is hurt both the seasons that he's there, and that turns into nothing. And then he ends up doing a great job with Jack Buck on CBS Radio, one of my favorite pairings ever. And to your point, Stram, I learned as much from listening to Hank Stram talk about football on that than I learned from anything.
And this will be the third 49er reference in this show. And that's, about par for the course when it's not my show. But Hank Stram and Vin Scully, the aforementioned Vin Scully, were the broadcasters for the 1981 game between the 49ers and the Cowboys. The catch game. You go to YouTube and listen to that game, which I clearly have. Or you just listen to the distilled 4-minute drive, which I obviously have, and it's Vince Scully and it's Hank Stram, and they're great together.
They really are. Yeah. I need to go back and watch. I've watched way too much old football. I always say to my wife, she's like, "What are you watching?" I go, "32-year-old football game, week 11, Bears, whatever."
And what does that do for her overall respect for you as a husband and as a human?
Reinforces where that respect lies, which is in the sub basement of the home that is respect.
Sub basement. So there's like a basement of the basement, basically.
You got to get out of the basement, get lower. You go in the sub basement of the basement, and that's
of the house.
The level of respect.
Okay.
Yep. Gotcha. Sure. Right, Minnesota, in contrast, following the loss, they went to the playoffs 13 times in that same period.
Yeah.
And went to 3 more Super Bowls. Lost all 3 of them. And that is why both Bud Grant and Hank Stram are in the Hall of Fame. And Grant went in 9 years before Stram did.
And Grant went in. But if you look at the Vikings, John, you say Carl Eller should be in the Hall of Fame. It took Paul Krause forever to get in the Hall of Fame.
Yeah.
When you don't win Super Bowls,
costs you.
Fair or not, the way you're judged in In the NFL, which is unlike really any other sport, if you ask me. I don't think even great basketball players, I think, you're judged by titles there to some degree, obviously, but
baseball's all statistically driven, essentially.
Yes. And hockey, I think, is a mix. But now, the NFL, man, if you don't win a Super Bowl,
I'll say this in baseball.
You've got a hill to climb.
I'll say this in baseball, though. There are also guys who are in because of championships. I think if the Pirates don't win in 60, Bill Mazeroski is not in the Hall of Fame, in my mind.
That's a good one.
He's a great player. He's an incredibly great defensive player, particularly Bill Mazeroski. But they don't win in 1960. I don't think he's in. But you're right about baseball is so statistically driven. The NBA essentially the same. But in the NFL, well, you play fewer games. There are very few, or even within the era that you play, the common opponents might not be there because you play so many fewer games. I mean, you may go 5 and 6 years without playing a franchise. So you may not come up against other players, but I think it's unfair. Paul Krause certainly deserved to be in the Hall of Fame,
and he is now. But it took him forever.
Yep, yeah, certainly deserved to get in early.
They lost 4 Super Bowls. Yeah.
So there it is. There's the road to Super Bowl 4. So what it really did, though, and the reason that we wanted to talk about it was that it reinforced that the AFL was now as good as the NFL. And I think if you would see moving forward, Super Bowl 5 is won by, well, it's 2 NFL teams in Super Bowl 5, essentially, because the Colts have moved to the AFC. Super Bowl 6, the Cowboys win, but then you have the Dolphins run, followed by the Pittsburgh run with Oakland thrown in there. The old AFL, now Pittsburgh, of course, was an NFL team, but the AFL teams that were now the AFC teams were on a par, if not better than NFC teams through that period.
Yeah, they were. NFC had a major run in the early 80s to mid 90s, but it's been, with New England clearly. Yeah. And, Baltimore. Now, Baltimore is an old NFL team. Well, actually, no, not this version. It's not an old NFL team.
No.
This is actually a new NFL team.
It's an expansion, right?
So it's the American Football Conference. But yeah, that is fascinating and not talked about. And the only thing that's really remembered from that Super Bowl, John, is Hank Stram being mic'd up. Yep. And that's really what most people voting for the Hall of Fame or whatever probably knew of Hank Stram too, for all those years. Let's keep matriculating down the field, boys. 65 power trap. Leonard, good stuff, man.
I've watched them so many times. Leonard, what are you doing in that huddle? What's taking so long? The guys are talking. Well, tell them to be quiet, Leonard. And Dawson always saying, when things were going well, I was Lenny. When it wasn't, I was a Leonard. Except we pulled Stram did pull Dawson at the end of the game. He ends up being the MVP of the game. I think I mentioned that earlier. And he ends up pulling him with a few minutes left and sends Mike Livingston, who really deserved to get some snaps in that game, given the 5-game winning streak that really helped them. They could have collapsed like a house of cards at that point. But he's then you did a great job, Leonard. A great job. So he's very serious there.
Lenny Dawson loses that Super Bowl. The Chiefs lose that Super Bowl. He may not be a Hall of Famer.
I would agree with you. He was the most successful quarterback.
It's amazing.
And they were the winningest team in the NFL. But you're right. He may not have gotten there. It went longer than I wanted it to, but we got a couple of Vin Scullys wanting to kill people in. And I think that really is the hallmark of this show. The dark side of Vin
Scully.
That
really is. And it's less time than your last one. So you're getting 1941. So you're getting better.
All right. Do we want to, just before we get out of here, do we want to let people know next week's deep dive?
Yes, let's do it. It's about Jesse Owens.
Second greatest Olympic moment ever.
I would argue that, and I will argue that vociferously next Friday. Remarkable run to get there. Remarkable story in his life and what he had to overcome, and then what he had to overcome after he reached the pinnacle. Yeah. That Big Ten championship the year before the 36 Olympics is as iconic as it comes. We'll get into that. And obviously the 36 Olympics, we'll get into, all of the Nazi mocking that we can. And but then afterwards, it's tough for him. Yeah. And his response to it is really interesting, John. And I think we'll get into that. I think we'll have some fun conversation. So Jesse Owens next week.
All right. Well, for Mark Ferreira and Jeff Taylor, this is John Pelkey. Thanks for sitting through our deep dive, the road to Super Bowl IV. We'll be back on Monday where we're going to have to unpack all of this stuff that happened that we didn't talk about today, despite the fact that Joe Conley's like, there's no way you're going to do a deep dive. My God. But it's like, I did the research. We're going to talk about this crap, whether people don't want to or not.
Right.
We said we don't do this for you. We do it because it's the only thing that keeps Mark and I from going Bruce Dern and walking into the ocean and never being heard from again.
It's, again, the truth of that getting starker and starker as the days go on.
All right. Have a great weekend, everybody. We will be back on Monday. Thanks for listening.